Welcome to Agronomy Moment. I'm your host, Wendell Cohen. We bring in people who agree with me, disagree with me, and above all, are not afraid to say it like it is. Our goal here is to challenge what we think, understand the why behind agronomical advice, and most of all, eliminate the noise in the room that are distractions so we can focus on the information that is relevant to your situation. A moment called now. All living things need the here and now. Crops won't grow with rain next month, sunshine this fall, or the right nutrient applied next year. Decisions to protect the life of living things require us as parents, leaders, and farmers to make decisions for the moment and in the moment. This makes farming fast-paced with limited information to act upon. This podcast is about farmers making decisions in the moment for end results that last not only a month, a season, or year, but a lifetime. Ultimately, even your children's future. Your crop needs a decision in the moment. Your farm needs a decision in the moment. And that's where we come in. Come for the agronomy and stay for the fun. Let's make decisions that increase your potential.
Good day, everybody. Remember last time Jon talked to us about pH. He provided us with a description of what it was, nutrient availability, as far as what happens, which crop is more sensitive to acid soils, and then he talked about acid rain and how that's changed over the years, how pH affects our different pests and controlling them, and then finally amending that. And so now this is video 2. We're going to dive into base saturation and what that is and how that relates to the pH of the soil and soil structure, etc., etc. Let's dive right in.
Let's move on. Base saturation. Okay, start now. First of all, explain base saturation, Jon. I'd like to hear your definition or how to explain that.
Yeah, so base saturation is going to be on your soil test. It's going to be an explanation in a percentage of the number of exchange sites that are occupied by a specific cation or a positively charged nutrient. So when we look at base saturations, one that are typically reported on a soil test are going to be your calcium, your magnesium, your potassium. You may have hydrogen on there depending on how extensive your soil test was, and you may see sodium on there as well. So those are going to give you a quick reading of what's occupying your exchange sites on that soil colloid. I went into agronomy when I was younger thinking that I wouldn't have to do math. Okay, so my outlook on agronomy was like, hey, we don't have to do math. Well, I was drastically wrong on that, because when all these soil test readings, all these base saturations are rooted in math. You look at mixing chemicals, you look at, all that stuff. It's all math. So I was wrong. But base saturation gets me out of a jam, because it's essentially taking a formula that includes your CEC, so the number of exchange sites you have, your parts per million on those positively charged ions that I talked about, your calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and then it spits it out and says this percent of your exchange sites are occupied by this nutrient. So the reason I like base saturation, I like to look at it. It gives me a baseline across soil types, across farms. Okay, so if you had, for example, a coarse textured soil, specifically a sand, maybe a sand, for instance, or a gravelly soil. If you had one of those that had a CEC of 5, we'll say 5. If you look at your base saturation of calcium and it's at 65%, you're sitting pretty good. If you go back and look at your parts per million of calcium, it's probably going to be in that 600 to 700 range. Okay, so my base saturation's good. Let me back up. If I were to build a perfect soil, I'd probably be 65 to 70% calcium on the base saturation. I'd probably be 10 to 14% on the magnesium, 5+% on the potassium and let the hydrogen and sodium and all the other very minuscule ones take up the rest. Okay. So with that being said, that kind of thought process can go across any soil type. So if you go from a sand with a CEC of 5, 700 parts per million on the calcium, base saturation 65, you're probably pretty good. You're probably having good nutrient interactions, good chemical reactions within the soil. Well, if I go to a heavier soil and it has a base saturation of 65, speaking of clay specifically here, if we look at that, and we had a 700 parts per million on a clay soil, we would be drastically deficient in calcium, and our base saturation would probably be, I'd have to do some math, but low. It'd be bad, 40%, something like that. So when we look at those, a clay-based soil, you're probably looking at 4,500 plus parts per million of calcium to get you that 65 to 70% base saturation. Okay, so without having to do all that math, throwing CECs into the equation, base saturation, you can look right there and say, oh, my percentages are this. And I could look at a base saturation and say it's only 1% to 2%, 1%, 2% potassium. I'm going to know that I got a potassium availability issue with that crop, regardless of soil type, regardless of parent material of the soil. So then I can go back and be like, all right, this is the CEC, this is the soil type. What can I do from a management standpoint to make that potassium more available? And so it's a great metric to gauge where you're at across multiple farms, across multiple soil types, without having to do a whole bunch of math, because we don't like that, and give you a nice baseline there. So that's how I use it. There's some thought about the calcium magnesium ratio has to be 4.5 to 1 or 3.0 to 1, depending on your soil type. Most universities would tell you that there's not a whole lot of merit to that specific ratio. And so I'd bring in kind of both schools of play, looking at the parts per million, looking at the base saturation, and giving me a baseline. Where do I need to investigate? What is causing this soil to be potentially deficient? Or what do we need to do to maintain the productivity and the positive qualities of this soil?
Gotcha. So that brings us kind of, you're already touching into the metrics of this. Since there's not a lot of merit in the calcium versus magnesium, you're saying 65, did I hear you right? 65 to 75% calcium, or explain that a little bit more, I guess. Clarify that a little more on how you like to bring those two together of.
Yep. So on your base saturations total, they need to equal 100%. Okay.
Yep.
So that's all your positively charged ions attaching to a soil colloid. And so if we can have 65 to 70% of those exchange sites being occupied by calcium, and we can have 10 to 14, 15% being occupied by magnesium, and around 5% being occupied by potassium. That gives the rest of the exchange sites to be occupied by hydrogen and sodium, are the two other more prevalent ones. And then there's a ton of other micronutrients that occupy a little bit of those exchange sites too. So if I could get those ratios, or if I can get close to those, typically we have free flow of nutrients available to that plant. We typically don't look at a scenario where we're having nutrient tie-up or antagonistic properties of one thing to the other.
Gotcha.
And so if those percentages fall within that range, a lot of times we will see a pretty productive soil as far as nutrient cycling, nutrient availability goes.
Okay, gotcha. How does this talk a little bit more about like what we can do? Is there anything we can do to change how much capacity our soil has as it relates to adding these nutrients in?
Yeah, so you're never going to change the parent material of your soil. That's went through thousands of years of weathering. It has to
Yep.
do with the mineral properties that actually form those soils when they were formed. It has to do with deposits from the environment. It has to do with your weather, your annual rainfall, how arid your region may be. And so to change your actual soil type and soil,
Sure.
basically soil type, that's not going to happen. What you can do is you can change the organic matter content in your soils, and you can change farming
Okay.
practices that will change what's known as the aggregate stability of your soil. And so when you look at aggregate stability, you look at basically how the soil is put together, how much air is in there, how much water is in there, how much nutrient makeup is in that. And you can change that through farming practices. And so if you have a soil, and a lot of times I think of this from a clay perspective, that has poor aggregate stability, typically those soils become compactive and they become what's known as slaty. So they have soil lines that kind of overlap like this, side to side,
Okay.
as opposed to like blocky, that would have just bigger chunks of aggregates in there. And so when you have those clays that get slaty like this, you lose pore space in there. So you lose oxygen space. When you do that, you have the reduction of some exchange sites there just because of um, physical inability for those soils to have space in them for exchange sites. Okay. So if we say we
Yep.
went to a no-till, we went all the way from full-blown tillage all the way to no-till cover cropping. Over time, over a few years, you would see that aggregate stability improve. You would see the pore space in your soil improve, and you could essentially see higher nutrient holding capacity by increasing that pore space, removing some of those compactions or slaty layers in the soil, and increasing a little bit of those exchange site activity there.
Gotcha. Interesting. And is there anything else, Selena, to jump in here before we move forward?
No, I don't think so.
Talk a little bit about the pore space, and this is interesting. I mean, there's a host of other benefits that come from increasing your pore space in your soil, right? Like, I mean, that's going to increase water infiltration, and a lot of other things. And it's like what you're saying. It's kind of the only thing we can do to change our soil, right? Like everything else is pretty much what you have.
Yeah, pretty much what you have. I mean, you can change the biological aspects of a soil pretty easily with either more biomass through uh, longer residue uh, breakdown on the soil. Think a no-till situation. You
Yep.
could add cover crops in there to increase the amount of biomass and change kind of some of that biological activity or biological community within the soil. Um,
Yep.
it takes time. There's no silver bullet out there that says, oh, why don't we just cart in, 5 ton of
Yep.
topsoil on my sand and we'll be fine. Well, you might see
Right.
benefit for a year, but you're diluting, 2 million tons in the top 6 inch, or excuse me, 2 million pounds of soil in the top 6 inch with what you're adding there. It's just going to be a dilution
Yeah.
effect over time. So you're
Yeah.
you're stuck with the soil you're stuck with, but that doesn't mean you
Yep.
can't improve productivity on that soil and the positive qualities of that soil. We can change that in almost any environment.
Yeah. That's well said. It's not a give up hope. I can't do anything about it, and yet it's just understanding what you do have and then working with that.
Absolutely.
That's it, guys, for today on our video number 2, our second one out of 3. This one's on base saturation. Next time we come back, we will be wrapping this up. pH, base saturation. We're going to be putting this in a nice little, neat little summarized package for you. in which you can look at what's our number one priority when we're looking at soil tests, when we're looking at our farms and different things, on how, after we've done this deep dive, get a background into why, and then the next video, we will summarize it up and show what we can do, you can do as a farmer. Let us know if you need anything. Until then, see ya. If you want alerts on what we are finding in the field, go to topagservices.com/signups to receive alert, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. It is our goal to bring you the most recent and advanced information possible. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We also ask you that you give us a like or follow our channel wherever you listen to your podcasts or watch these videos. This ultimately helps us reach more people like you. Hey, this has been Wendell Cohen, your show host. Thank you to all who made this show possible. This show is over. See ya.